Today's speaker is an industrial designer by training. He's earned numerous design awards and has exhibited work in the Access Gallery in Tokyo, the Design Museum in London, and the Museum of Modern Art here in nearby New York. Our speaker advises senior executives and boards of Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 companies. He's led strategic client relationships in organizations including those with Mayo Clinic, Microsoft, Pepsi, Procter & Gamble, and Steelcase. He has a special interest in the convergence of technology and the arts, as well as in ways in which design can be used to promote the well-being of people living in emerging economies. He's on the board of the Mayo Innovation Advisory Council and the Advisory Council of the Acumen Fund, a nonprofit global venture fund focused on empowering the lives of the poor. I probably could go on. I've got more pages.
But it's getting boring, so let's not.
Please join me in welcoming Tim Brown. So I had a short question to start off. I was doing some research on very old thinking, and I came up with a quote that said, "Well begun is half done." What do you think?
My version of that would be ask the right question, ask a creative question, and the creative solution comes a whole lot easier. You know, so yeah, I do believe in the well begun, but for the challenge of innovation, it's the beginning is in the question. What question are you asking? Where do the insights come from that cause you to ask that question? And I think if you do that well, somehow the solutions seem to emerge relatively well. If you do that badly, it can be really hard work.
And then how do you get who are the right people that you need to get to ask the right question? And how do you get them together?
Well, one of the challenges is a lot of the people you need to ask the right question are not even in your organization. Right? I mean, they're out in the world. They're living lives that you're trying to solve for. And so you may never get them in the room in person, but you need to get them in the room in terms of them making a contribution. And I think that in order to do that, we all, in business have to essentially be anthropologists. We all have to be out in the world looking and understanding and visiting with people and understanding them at a level of depth that allows you to bring them into the room in a way where they're giving you useful insights. The difference between asking people questions in a survey and rifling through their kitchen cabinets to find out what food they really eat can be quite revealing, right? And can make a very big difference to the question you ask. Let's say you're working on healthy food for a large food manufacturer or something. And so I think more and more with innovation, the skill is in bringing people into the room who are actually, say, not part of your organization. So they might be customers, consumers, or potential ones in places you don't yet even have a market. They might be potential partners that you've not even thought of working with yet. And so, I see a big part of the role of innovators in the world, whether you're part of large organizations or you're an entrepreneur, is to spend a lot more time out in that world and maybe rather less time in one's own organization in a traditional sense.
Does that imply a completely different kind of frequency of feedback and for people who are normally inside the firm?
Well, I was sort of taught a fairly interesting lesson about that by A.G. Lafley, who I worked with for quite a few years while he was CEO of P&G. I mean, he would never, ever go anywhere, without making time to go wander around the supermarkets and stores in the place that he was at. Doesn't matter whether he was coming to San Francisco or he was going to Beijing or wherever. He would never go anywhere, and he would drag whoever was supposed to be meeting with him out into those supermarkets too, and often have half the meeting while we're wandering around the aisles of the stores, because he believed that he got more insights, asked better questions, had better conversations when he was in that environment. If he can do it, at the time was maybe in the top 50 world's most busiest executives, then pretty sure most other people can do it. So for him, it was a constant all the time thing, not waiting for every 2 or 3 months for his market research group to turn up with the latest report about beauty care in Southeast Asia, or antiperspirant in Russia, or whatever it might be. So it was this kind of constant all the time thing for him, and I've tried to give that advice to other organizations that we work with.
It seems like that is a big mind shift for all kinds of enterprises from, say, 20 years ago to where people need to be now. And one of the phrases that people used to use before was, I'm looking for some runway. And how do you think about things now? I mean, is there runway to be found anywhere?
I mean, I think that the word runway, implies a desire for predictability, right? That somehow I can see out into the future and have a pretty good sense of what's going on. I don't think we've lived in that kind of world for quite a while. We maybe never lived in that kind of world. Maybe we're kidding ourselves that we did.
Mm-hmm.
But for a decently long run, post Second World War, business, certainly here in America and to some degree in Europe, kind of did get its kind of act together in a sense that it could, or thought it could see some way ahead. But that just simply doesn't exist for almost any kind of business. I mean, there are some that have to look out into the future. If you're prospecting for oil, I presume you have to be thinking about the future of reasonable ways out ahead in a way that other organizations might not. But no, we live in a kind of a real time world. It's as volatile as it's perhaps ever been, and some would argue that it's going to get steadily more and more volatile, which is a difficult thing to comprehend, really. But there are some out there arguing that that's what's going to happen. And so this constant adaptation, and innovation is a form of adaptation, is the world in which we will have to operate our businesses.
So I explained to Mr. Brown that the Yale MBA students, the first years, have just recently gotten back from their international experiences, and about 40% of our second year students participated in the network immersion weeks. And these are experiences that I think are really important to us, and they give us a chance to say, okay, how do we take knowledge that we're developing here and think about a completely different setting? But going back to what you just said about the lack of runway and the need to adapt very quickly, how do you do it in terms of your teams working with different companies? And I guess at one end of the spectrum you could say every situation is different.
Right.
And the other end of the spectrum, it could be, well, I've got a formula for design and innovation, and I'm going to roll it out sector by sector, country by country,
right,
and plow ahead.
Yeah.
How do you approach the terrain globally with your teams and your organizations?
So I think it's less about formula, and I don't think we do have any formulas. And when we think we have them, we usually are wrong about that. But the pace of change isn't the same for everything, right? And one of the great kind of advantages we have when we look at the world from a design perspective, and looking at the world from a design perspective is absolutely looking at how we mediate the world on behalf of people. I mean, I think of design emerged as something we were interested in as a society as we started to create more and more technology for ourselves. And the more technology we have, and I mean the broader sense of technology, including language and farm implements and printing, and these are all technologies, right? They just happened a long time ago. that the more technology we have, the more we have to figure out how to mediate the world between us as human beings and that technology. It's kind of what design is. It's figuring out how to make the world work for us. You know, it's not, the difference with science is about figuring out how the world is. Design is about how to make the world work for us, right? And the cool thing about looking at the world through a design lens is there's one thing that doesn't change all that fast, and that's us. Human beings actually don't change that fast. Our physical state doesn't change very fast at all. In fact, it changes on, at a rate of very little change over hundreds of thousands of years. Our minds evolve slowly. Our cultural constructs evolve a little bit faster, but they surprisingly don't evolve as fast as we might think. And so we do at least have one piece of the puzzle which is relatively slow to change. So we can learn things about people, and it turns out they're still true more than 10 minutes later, which is not the true of technology, right? We learn things about technology today, and they're out of date and wrong tomorrow. And so on the one hand, you've got slow change. People, start with people, at least you're looking through things that you can be relatively sure about. And some of these things are really interesting. If, for instance, our attitudes about money, for instance. You're at business school, you guys think about money a little bit, right? Our attitudes about money change surprisingly slowly, and they are actually culturally connected, right? So there are parts of the world which have a very different view of money than we do here in North America. Our view of money based in North America comes from the founding of the country. It comes from this idea of individualism and entrepreneurialism and work ethic. In Asia and in the Middle East, money is a family thing. Money is managed by families, not by individuals. So the way that you think about building banking services, for instance, in those parts of the world should be fundamentally different from the way you build banking services here in North America. And by the way, those attitudes have been in place for a couple of hundred years. So these things are things we can learn, and they're really valuable. And then there are systems within which we work in. You could think of them, I suppose, as industry systems or business systems, like the way healthcare gets delivered, for instance, which has evolved relatively slowly over a reasonably long period of time. And if you know a little bit about how that system works, then you can intervene and work and do something creative in healthcare and take what you will learn from doing it last time and apply it next time. And so I think, and then as I say, the stuff that moves so fast you can barely keep up with it is the technology stuff. So I think understand people, know something about the systems that you're working in, and then live with the fact that you're going to be second guessing yourself around what technology is going to be able to do.
And so I find this framework, well, maybe you even don't want to call it a framework, but a way of getting one's thinking organized very helpful. So people are the relatively constant piece of this, and then there are systems. And then there's this other stuff that's changing relatively quickly. When you're approaching a problem and working on design, innovation, and improvement, then are there things that you sort of go to find out whether you're on course? I mean, you mentioned the CEO of P&G, the former CEO, of just always asking questions. And are there things that you do to acquire information and get feedback, or you encourage your teams to do, or you would encourage us to do on an everyday basis?
There are principles which, I mean, I don't think they have to, they're not necessarily universal, but there's certainly things that I look at, which at least for me are a general indication of whether you're on the right track or not. One of those principles when it comes to people is that is what I'm doing simplifying the world for the people I'm actually trying to help? Because if I'm complexifying it, I'm pretty sure I'm on the wrong track. And that doesn't mean am I taking complexity out of the whole system, because you almost never can. In fact, the systems are generally getting more and more complex all the time. But can I simplify the experience for the people that I'm trying to help? So if I'm trying to help somebody in a healthcare setting, for instance, is what I'm doing making it easier for them to navigate their way through what is inevitably a very complicated system? And if it is, then I feel like I'm making a contribution, because apart from anything else, I'm giving them the opportunity to understand more about what's happening to them. I'm giving them the space perhaps to make better decisions. Perhaps I'm giving them the space to have a sort of emotionally more satisfying experience. And so that's an example of, and I think we each, and I think these are sort of tend to be sort of personal things, can sort of decide what we want those principles to be. I mean, when I'm thinking about institutional organizations, and we're thinking about maybe systems level innovation, are the core ideas that we're developing ones that will adapt and survive the inevitable fast-paced technology change? Because if they're totally reliant on a moment with regard to technology, then you can be pretty sure they won't be around for very long. So that they may be valuable in the short term, but they're not likely to be valuable, in the long term. So can we see how this change that we're making is going to adapt and be useful to people, no matter what happens, or perhaps given some level of change of technology. So I mean, just a couple of examples, but I think, and you probably don't want 20 of these, but there's some set of those principles that give you a sense of whether you're on the right track or not.
I have one more chunk of questions, and then we'll open it up. So for those of you who are getting your questions ready, now you should really get your questions ready. So I have my own sort of personal innovation challenge, real time. But I'm curious about what extent price comes into play. And for those of you who have heard me talk about this, I'm sort of critical of US business schools, even though I've been part of the problem in some sense. So I can't say this without sort of explaining, that I admit I'm part of the problem. But fundamentally, US business schools have gotten themselves to a very high price point. So it seems to me that when we think about our innovation set, we have to take into account price. So just to give you some data, many of you were very young back in 1990, 1991. Some of you may not even been born, but I think everybody was probably born by then. So tuition at Yale School of Management back then was about, and fees, was about $17,000. Since then, we've increased price by about 250%. So next year, our prices will be about $57,000. And that's a lot of increase. And you might say, well, that's how does that compare to inflation? Our consumer price index, producer price index, way more, is more than double measures of inflation. Then you might say, well, that's what's happened in higher education, right? No. We're even, the higher education price index, we're still much faster than the higher education price index. So I guess, it's just one sort of oddball question maybe for you, but when you go in and you encounter these maybe dinosaur industries, we're not one, but I mean, do you ever just sort of look at the prices and sort of go, you've got a problem?
I'm a little nervous as somebody who went through 7 years of art school talking about price with an economist. I don't feel like I'm not exactly on home territory here. But yeah, I mean, and particularly as we see more and more evidence of things that are disrupting other industries that are getting significantly disrupted by very low price but very high value alternatives to whatever the traditional model was. The thing that I suppose I would look at it from a whole bunch of different directions when I was thinking about education. One is, I have you got to wonder about how are we possibly going to educate the billions of people that we need to educate to much higher levels in order to kind of better manage the world that we're in. Hard to see how we do that if we only have the ultra high price model available to us that educates a very small elite. Not that elite isn't an invaluable concept. It's just that we need to find ways of taking some of the goodness that institutions like this have and spreading it out across much larger groups of people. And then there's the problem of speed of change, which means that the value of the learning that you get at the beginning of your career, as it then spreads out over the rest of your career, in theory looks like it's going to go down, right? That whereas once in this world of Runway, it may have been reasonable to expect the value of that education to last for quite a long time. Now it's already happened at the undergraduate level. There's almost zero value to the actual knowledge set that you come out of an undergraduate degree with, right? There's some value to the institution, and there's lots of value to the network, but there's very little value to the knowledge set. And we know we're going to have to acquire lots of knowledge through our careers if we're going to have any chance of having successful careers in the future. So that's another problem that needs to get solved. So how do we start to break it up a little bit, spread it out over people's careers in different ways? And then there's the good old Clay Christensen argument, which is just go look for those high-priced industries that are they're innovating by adding cost all the time, and just look for somebody who's doing it in a much less expensive, less good way, because chances are that's going to be the industry of the future. I don't think, in my view, there's anything out there today that I see that looks like it's doing that already, but there's a lot of experimentation going on. And there's a lot of need, right? I mean, you see what the needs of China, India, the rest of Southeast Asia, South America have for educating successful business people. We're going to start seeing some interesting innovations emerge. And I love what you're doing here, which is building those networks out now across those regions. I think in terms of sort of institutional resilience, that's probably a very smart thing to do.
Well, with that, we feel like we got a little endorsement from one of the absolute leaders in this field, so I feel good. I'm going to stop and open it up to questions for Tim Brown, all the way in the back. And I know we have microphones, so just pause a moment and we'll get started.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I'm an MBA student. Something that I'm really curious about is the open IDEO platform. I've had the opportunity to look through it. I think it's a great way of crowdsourcing ideas. Something that I'm curious about, and maybe resonates also with this question about higher education, is how does that affect you in terms of your competitiveness? I say it's similar to education, thinking about online classes, that type of access to information. Similarly, as you mentioned before, you're looking for outside opinions, and it's a great way of funneling kind of those ideas. But how do you see IDEO moving forward? Do you see that as a competitive threat, or how do you imagine yourself integrating that into your design process?
I see all kinds of competitive threats out there for IDEO. It's really kind of exciting, actually. And this was one instance where we decided we're going to create one for ourselves rather than wait for somebody else to do it to us. We had a team that was really convinced that they could start to get some of the goodness of what we did as a firm to happen out on a network with a vaster number of people working on challenges that somehow inherently would benefit from that participation. They were convinced that they could do it, and they are a couple of years into, I think, what's going to be an experiment that's going to evolve over time. And we did actually ask the question several years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, which was what happened if instead of being 500 people, which is what IDEO was at the time, we were 50,000 people, but we didn't have to hire the other 49,500. And we are pretty close to being 50,000 people on Open IDEO now. So we're beginning to find out what IDEO looks like when it's at 50,000 people. And we're finding out that it does some things very much better than IDEO does. And it does some things that are very different. and it certainly does them very much less expensively. So far we haven't had all of our clients come and say, sorry, we're not going to work with you anymore, we're just going to go work with Open IDEO. We do have a bunch where we work with both. And we, by the way, it's not obvious from using Open IDEO, there are other instances of Open IDEO that are private, that exist just within organizations, uses the same technology, that work on sort of commercial stuff inside organizations. That's where we think that ultimately we think there's a lot of potential that comes from that, from essentially connecting organizations together, to giving them platforms that allow, particularly employees, in some cases it might be customers as well, of these organizations to actually co-create. But the Open IDEO platform itself is giving us an opportunity to work on challenges that, to be honest with you, IDEO would be far too expensive a way of solving. But the most exciting thing is we're coming up with insights I don't think we would have ever seen otherwise. I mean, there are odd instances, like we're working on a project on food sheds in Australia, one of the early challenges that we did. And if we'd have done that normally with inside IDEO, we'd have worked with lots of people in Australia, and we'd have worked with lots of people at IDEO. Some of the best ideas came from a guy who was a surfer living in Latvia. Right? Pretty sure we wouldn't have asked him to be part of the project team if we'd have been doing it in the normal way. So, so that's cool. We do another project on sanitation in Ghana, which was actually a project that started off on Open IDEO and then morphed into we have a non-profit version of IDEO, IDEO.org, some of you may have heard of. So it started off on Open IDEO and then went into IDEO.org, where it's still going today. But by doing the Open IDEO piece, in 2 weeks, we found out as much about everything else that was going on out in the industry that an expert team had already been working on the project for 2 years beforehand had found out. So it was a very efficient way of kind of tapping into the world. So it's an experiment in disrupting ourselves. I honestly don't know where it's going to end up, but we're enjoying the experiment, and we think we're beginning to have some impact with it.
Hi, thank you very much. This is very interesting. It's a little bit different of a take on innovation. I'm curious if the planet were to walk into your office and say, I've got 9 billion people that I have to feed, and more importantly, that I have to provide power to over the next 30 years. But I've got this system that is putting way too much CO2 in the atmosphere. But it's entrenched, and there's not a role for human-centered design as much, I think, because we're providing commodity to people. How do you think about innovation in that context, and what would you advise your client?
I love the idea of the planet being a client. I've not thought of that one before, but I'm going to go try that one out. I like that a lot. Yeah, I mean, it is an amazingly complex set of constraints that we have to work with, and I do think we need to find ways of breaking open some of the artificial constraints we put on problems like this because of national political requirements, the way industries work today. I think if we, there are little clues out there, and they're very small right now, I admit, but little clues that if we can engage people in the right way, get them to participate in some of these things in the right way, we can actually begin to shift behaviors. Because in a lot of cases, it seems to me a lot of these issues are about changing our behavior as people, not actually in solving fundamental technical challenges. I mean, yeah, there are some issues around energy storage which we would love to deal with in order to better be able to balance fossil fuels and renewable fuels, and we'd love some ways of dealing with water differently than we're dealing with it today, perhaps, particularly in terms of local use and regeneration of water resources that we don't really have great ideas around today. So there are a few places where there are some technical challenges, but for the most part, they're behavioral challenges. We waste stuff in places where we've got plenty of resource, which means we don't have it available to use in the places where we currently don't have enough. Particularly true of food. It's clear we can create enough food, we just don't create it in the right places, we don't get it to the right people, and we have some really broken models of what efficient food production really looks like. I was astounded by a talk that I saw at the TED conference a couple of weeks ago by this guy called Alan Savory, who's a Zimbabwean guy some of you may have heard of, who for 30 years ago figured out how to reverse desertification. Oh, and by the way, produced 4 times as much protein out of cattle or animal stocks at the same time, right? That sounds like a completely ridiculous, magical solution, but he's been running these programs for 30 years, where by highly intensive, constantly moving around stocks of cattle, you bring back deserts and you actually regenerate grasslands. 30 years, and we still don't know about. We're still not accepting this as a way of solving the problem. We're not using it, all over the world. So we have a problem of moving the knowledge around. We have a problem of moving the resources around. But I think fundamentally it's about behavior, and so we have to. I think the work of the next decade or two, or I don't know how long it's going to take, is going to be beginning to really crack this idea of understanding behavior, what drives behavior, designing to support behavior change. And this is true whether you're talking about how we use planetary resources, it's true of dealing with chronic diseases, it's true of dealing with crime, it's true of dealing with many of the issues that most either negatively affect quality of life today and could positively affect it as we move forward in the future. And we are still, it's wonderful to see all the work going on in behavioral economics. It's wonderful to see all the work going on in behavioral science. And as designers, we're tapping into that as much as we can. And we have behavioral economists and behavioral scientists at IDEO. And there are some places which are beginning to have some success. But I think we've still got a long way to go. But I believe that cracking that, I believe that understanding how to really provide the context, much of which is social, by the way, for nudging, to use the trendy term, nudging behavior in the right way. That I think is probably the route to succeeding around successfully solving the problem for the client called the planet.
So I'm kind of interested in building on this behavior topic. And as I think about what innovation means, a lot of it is change. And by the time an organization comes to you, some elements are probably interested in change, but other parts of the organization may not be prepared for it. So I'm kind of curious, what are the barriers that you most commonly come up against to the adoption of your suggestions? And how do you approach that with an organization to allow change to take place?
So this is where you guys will come in. We were talking about it a bit before. The reason so I'll tell you a bit of a history of IDEO story just to help frame this up. So up until about 10 years ago, we had a very simple view of the world. We were kind of creative people, and we worked with clients. Their job was to know the business, and our job was to come up with the ideas, right? And so when we came up with ideas, it was our client's job to go off and implement them. And we were constantly frustrated by how rarely that actually happened. It happened quite well in the startup world, where our clients were entrepreneurs and were building the organizations to launch our ideas. There's a clue there. They were building the organizations to launch our ideas. But with large companies, it failed far too much at the time. And so, we thought about it for a long time because we're slow. And we realized a couple of things. Firstly, that it turned out that our clients, while they were experts on their business as it had been, they were not experts on how to evolve their business for the future. So they, often because of lack of bandwidth, they simply didn't have people who were, advanced in creative marketing folks or creative operational folks who could pick up new ideas and figure out how the organization had to shift and evolve in order to make the most of the ideas. They simply didn't have the bandwidth, or they didn't have the knowledge. And so we realized that if we were going to increase the rate at which our ideas were going to get out into the world, which to be honest is why most people like us get into this work, is because we want to see our work out in the world, we were going to have to start to figure that stuff out for our clients. So we started looking for people with business backgrounds we could bring into the firm. And over the last 10 years, we've gone from nobody for now it's somewhere between 15 and 20% of the firm, I guess, of people who've got some kind of business background. They also all have some kind of creative background, so they know how to work with weird people like us, and don't get too frustrated with us. But so they've got engineering backgrounds or product design backgrounds or architecture, or they've done product management somewhere, or they've launched a business, or they've done something that, or they were, in some cases it's kind of more artistic stuff, but they've got some sort of creative background. And so we've slowly been building our own capacity to at least tell the business story to our clients alongside the idea, so that we give them a sense of what to do. And now we're realizing, so now we've got quite good at that, and we're quite good at designing business models to support more disruptive innovations and convincing our clients we actually have a clue as to how they might make money out of some of this stuff. And so we've got that figured out, and we still haven't solved the problem. We've increased the number of things we get out into the market. We've increased the number of times that our clients will launch a new venture rather than just try and ram the new idea inside their existing organization. That's all increasing. It's looking good. But we realize we're still not anything like at the level of performance that we want to be. So now the challenge that we're facing and that we're doing more about is how we can sort of help intervene in their organizations to make them more ready to accept change and be more ready for change themselves. And, if you like, increase the level of tolerance for innovation inside organizations. That's long and hard work. It isn't about running a few workshops and expecting the company to change its behavior overnight. It's about giving them tools, maybe tools like internal versions of IDEO. It's about giving them new processes to work with. It's about spreading that out across the organization. So it takes a lot of time, but I believe it's going to be necessary. That until we build our organizations to be tolerant of and indeed anticipating change and innovation, it will be very hard to get new ideas to happen.
So if I could follow up, are some of those ideas getting firms, enterprises to go to the client more frequently and get feedback?
Some of
the market.
Some of it's about the innovation process itself. Yeah. So some of it's about being more better inquiry, understanding consumers. Some of it's about increasing the speed at which organizations try out their ideas, prototype, and get feedback, which turns out to be one of the things that slows, if not kills, ideas. I mean, I'm sure a bunch of you have read The Lean Startup, that's an extreme version of that idea, but the faster you put something out there, the faster you learn, the faster you evolve, the faster your idea gets better. Large organizations often have very many mechanisms which are designed to prevent that from happening, prevent you from learning fast. And so that's an important one. In some cases, it's actually very simple ideas like quality of storytelling inside organizations. I mean, organizations that rely, I know you've got Craig Mundy from Microsoft coming soon, and he's heard me say this before, PowerPoint is the worst possible mechanism for telling anybody a good story, right? And yet PowerPoint, is 95% of the time is the media through which people inside businesses tell the stories about what it is they plan to do. And you'd be better off standing up in front of the room and waving your hand, in my opinion, than you are using something that constrains you into this sort of linear, non-emotional, entirely functional story about why this thing is going to change people's lives. Never does. So things like that make a difference.
So if I were just trying to get takeaways right now, I should be thinking about, I should go to people and ask, are changes making things better, less complicated, and I should be doing that more frequently.
In every part of the organization.
In every part of the organization.
In every part of the organization. He's not so fashionable.
It's not that complicated.
It's not that complicated.
But I can't wait and defer that for the next quarter.
No, and I don't think you can delegate it. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. I think this notion, this historic notion of professional management being about professional delegation I don't believe is the right notion of professional management. Professional management, I believe, is about professional participation, right? And that's what entrepreneurs do, right? I mean, great entrepreneurs are successful because they participate in the creation of the business. They don't delegate it to somebody else. When we get into large organizations, we seem to confuse management with delegation, or being professional as being a great delegator. And I don't believe that's possible in a world which is constantly changing. I believe we have to be professional participants and finding ways to do that, even if it's just sticking your nose into every part of the organization as a CEO and asking why things aren't changing, why things are still more complicated than they need to be. I mean, I know he's not as popular as he once was, but Tom Peters wrote some amazing stuff about this 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago.
How many people know Tom Peters?
Does anybody know who Tom Peters was? I mean, he was one of the first great management gurus, and but he wrote several books on this idea of applying essentially this design and innovation lens to every bit of the organization. And he was kind of a bit messianic about it, or maybe that, but he was right. I mean, he got that stuff a long time ago. Go back and read some of his books; they're worth looking at.
So, obviously, you still have to, if you're a manager, you still have to prioritize and delegate. But I think, is it fair to say what you're saying? You can't delegate the feedback. You can't delegate the connection to the client and the innovation process.
And you can't. And I don't believe you can delegate if you haven't gone through the cycles yourself. So I hope I'm not a huge fan of learning everything via case studies. Right? I think case studies are valuable. They give you a grounding. But sorry, I know you're a business school. That's fine. But I think the balance is learning that way and learning by participating. In other words, project-based learning, as well as case study learning. And I say this whichever business school I go to. I said it to Harvard. They like it even less there. But it's true. Unless you've gone through the cycle of starting something and then implementing it, it's very hard for you to be a manager later on and understand what people are going through. Whether you do that as an entrepreneur with your own business, whether you do it based on projects you do at school, whether you make sure you get those experiences as you go into larger organizations, where they are available. I mean, you go, be a, brand manager somewhere and go launch a brand or launch a new product and see how well it does and figure out why it didn't do what you thought it was going to do. Or you just go through the whole product development process of going from an idea and figuring out how to manufacture it. Those cycles are incredibly valuable. And I'd say this is the piece of advice I would be most strong about is go find all the places you can to go through those cycles, and as many of them as you can, because every one is just incredibly precious when it comes to having judgment later on.
And presumably degree of difficulty is good here.
Yeah, but yes. I mean, obviously, the more difficult they are, the more you learn. But even simple things. I mean, I think even launching a new feature on a digital product, which you can do in a week, you learn something from that. So I wouldn't. So
okay, so maybe degree of difficulty might correlate to length, which would be bad.
Yeah.
Get more experience.
I'm a big believer in Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule. Like lots of practice does make a difference. Yep. And when it comes to innovation, practice means going through the cycle.
Okay.
It actually doesn't mean doing the same thing over and over again. So I wouldn't encourage you. You might be really interested in the sort of kind of anthropological bit of innovation, but I wouldn't suggest that means go and spend all your time only doing research. Because if you don't understand the implications of what it is that you're learning, if you don't understand where that all leads, if you don't understand how that leads all the way back to how a product might be marketed, for instance, then you're not getting it. You're not getting enough of the context. And so I'd encourage you to go find cycles to go through.
Okay, how about right here?
So in one of your answers, you touched briefly on the relationship between adaptation and innovation. And I was hoping you could speak a little more on the way you think about that interaction between adaptation, innovation, and what otherwise might seem just kind of like a natural evolutionary process.
I'm still learning about this. I don't claim to be. I claim to have a very clear perspective on it. Other than that, I'm much more of a believer in the kind of biological view of this than I am in the kind of mechanical view. And so, that would tend to lead you to the perspective that, an ecosystem that is exposed to some kind of disruptive force will either die or will adapt. Right? And so if you think of your own business, your own institution, your own organization being part of perhaps a broader ecosystem, but in itself being an ecosystem, then the more you can expose it earlier to things that might be disruptive, the faster it's likely to adapt, or the more likely it is to adapt rather than die. I mean, that's what the biologists would tell us, I believe. And so I think that means that if you're a large organization or an institution that's been around a while, that you might want to think about where can I put bits of my organization so that they're likely to get exposed to whatever these disruptive external forces might be. So for instance, when we were talking earlier about the fact you've got this network now where you're connected to all of these institutions in these emerging economies, that's a pretty good example of putting yourself in places where the disruptions, they're far more likely to happen there than they are perhaps here on the East Coast or here in New Haven or wherever. So, and so I think one of the strategic things that anybody who's running an organization needs to do is to think, well, where am I exposing my organization to those disruptive forces that might allow me to adapt or us to adapt? And then the other trick is, so first you've got to expose yourself to them, then you've got to listen to them when they happen, right? You've actually got to, so again, you think about our immune system, right? Our immune system does a pretty good job of, when it's exposed, of listening, right, and then doing something about it. That's how the whole system works. Another failure mode for large organizations is they actually do expose themselves to these disruptions, then don't listen, don't actually take note of the fact, don't respond. And I think that organizations that have cultures which are perhaps a little bit more self-directed, self-organized, that are a little bit more emergent, perhaps, where not everything is controlled from the center, I believe are slightly more likely to respond to those disruptions and do something about it, and therefore have a greater opportunity to adapt.
So this idea that facts are friendly, including disruptive facts. I mean, it's scary sometimes, right? And you're suggesting, I mean, fundamentally, you have to be engaged and open, and then think about a response.
I think so. I think if you go back to kind of any kind of first principles, it's hard to imagine how that wouldn't be what you were forced to do. I mean, there's no, I can't see any evidence that would indicate organizations that did the opposite of that shuttered themselves away, hoisted themselves away, get it absolutely right, and then defend the wars to the best of their abilities that they just don't do very well. And so yeah, I think that is that's the challenge of organizational culture today, is to get that balance between kind of receptiveness, those tentacles you want out in the world, the responses that come from that, and yet still an ability to, prioritize and direct resources where they can be effective and scale things up. And that's a tremendous challenge. And I don't know, I think there are lots of things we don't know about businesses and management today, and I think that's one of the things we don't know, which is what's the best way to do that. Because you look at the examples that everybody cites, like at Google, for instance, which is doing a fairly good job of doing lots of responding to things that are going on in the world and creating new stuff. But they have this wonderful advantage of throwing off cash at the moment, so they can afford to invest in all that kind of stuff, right? Not all businesses are in that state all the time. Because if the future is the only ones that are going to adapt to the ones that are throwing off lots of cash, then that's a bit problematic. So I don't know that it's completely obvious to what exactly the right approach is to learning fast, responding, and then growing that in order to remain a sort of large and growing organization. Maybe the future is we don't have these large organizations. Maybe the future is that we have a world that is far more networked, where organizations in general are of smaller scale than they are today, but they can leverage the networks that they're part of, the environments they're part of, far more effectively. That's possible. Again, you look at sort of biological history, and it turns out that that as our own ecosystem, the planet got more competitive, the large organisms mostly went away, right? I mean, the planet used to be full of really big mammals, right? Before that, really big reptiles. And they all went away because they couldn't change fast enough. So I don't know, it might be interesting. Maybe the same's going to happen with big companies and big governments. I don't know. Who knows?
Next question, yes.
So in business school, we tend to love frameworks and formulas and ways to navigate the amounts of information and opportunities that exist. And it seems as though there might not be a framework for the future, a framework that is looking as far ahead as we want. And so I'm actually curious, as you personally, as a leader, how do you navigate all these opportunities, and what kind of advice in that area do you have for us?
I think some of my colleagues, particularly the more sort of business-minded ones, IDEO would say that I'm not the best person to ask about. I'm not very good at making choices about the future. I'm fascinated by almost everything. That could be an issue for us. But you know, I think there are some challenges that we face. One of which is I'm noticing this about the world. I've certainly noticed about IDEO. That as we have tried to understand and embrace, you know, ever more complexity in the world around us, we found it harder and harder to think about the future. Right? I mean, it's almost as though there's a sort of a kind of elastic perimeter, but as you stretch it out that way, you sort of bring it in terms of in the future. It's much easier to think about the future if I'm thinking about something like Moore's law, for instance. So I'm thinking about how many processing cycles can I fit on a chip? That's not very broad, right? It's not very complicated. Well, I can think about the future of that. In fact, we have the formula, right, for the future. But that doesn't help me think about how an education system is going to work in 30 or 40 years. Now, so one of the tricks that I'm trying to slowly learning, and some other people I think are really good at this, is okay, take the things that you can begin to think about the future around, and then imagine what the future of everything else will be like when those particular trustworthy things have happened. So demographics is a great one, right? We know our demographic future, we know for at least 40, 50 years. Right? We know exactly how many people are going to be on the planet, give or take, a relatively small margin for error. And so you can imagine what's going to happen when we've got a society that's far more it's aged a lot more than it has today. You can imagine when we've got population centers that are different from what we have today, because we can sort of know that stuff. We can know what some things in technology are likely to do. We don't know what the disruptive ones are going to be, because we can't imagine. We always get that wrong, but we know some things. We know about things like processing power. And so for me, the way to think about the future is to assemble the things that you do think you know something about, including the things that you don't think are going to change very fast, like as I was saying before, like human beings, and then wonder what it will be like in that world when those things come to pass. And you can speculate about whether there are going to be any completely disruptive things that you didn't know about, but at least you can begin to wonder based on a set of things that are reasonably trustworthy. And I think the way to think about the future is that way. It's to speculate based on the things you think you might know something about, and then use our imaginations to wonder how all the rest of the pieces might fit together. Because time and time again, in various ways, we've shown that actually a lot of our future is based on what we decide we want it to be. Right? So when you think of how often some movie producer has put something in a movie, and then scientists have spent the next 20 years inventing the thing that got put into that movie. It happens time and time again, right? Right now we're working on the tricorder. Do you remember, any of you watched Star Trek, right? That thing that could scan over over somebody and know exactly what was wrong with it? Well, there are a bunch of companies working on exactly that thing now, right? And there's an X Prize based on it. So maybe in the next 10 years we'll actually get a tricorder. We already got the communicator and a bunch of other things. So we have a habit of imagining the future and then working our way towards it. So I would actually encourage us, and this is true of at the kind of planetary scale stuff too. I think we're doing far too little imagining the futures we want to have. And if we spent a little bit more of our energy on that, we're actually quite creative of figuring out how we might work towards them. And I'm not suggesting we be all utopian about it either. I mean, I think what would be really clever is if we could figure out futures we want to have that actually take into account how we really are as human beings, rather than how we wished we were. But I'd love for us to spend more time imagining the healthcare system we really want to have. I'd love us to spend more time imagining the education systems we really want to have, the markets we really want to have, the organizations we really want to have. And then as human beings, we're quite ingenious at working our way towards the things if we care enough about them.
I think we have time. Do we have time for one more question? It's always a daunting task. Who would like to have the last question? Okay, you started us off. You get to close us off.
My lucky day. So I used to work in design as well, and at an architectural firm. And at the end of the year, we'd go through all the projects and say, okay, these are the projects that we're going to associate ourselves with. We're kind of going to forget that these ever happened. Something that I'm curious about in your long career, like what is the project that you're most proud of? And can you tell us about it and why you think it's the best project you've worked on at all?
Part of my problem with having this sort of ADHD, where I love going from one thing to the next, is my favorite thing is it's usually just happened, rather. But so I'm really proud of the fact that we just finished working on designing a whole school system for Peru, where we did the schools and the curriculum and the technology and the knowledge sharing tools for the teachers and the business model that supports the school system. That's pretty cool, because it's an indication that maybe we can tackle these things in some sort of holistic way. Now, we've only built the first 8 schools, so it's a bit early to declare success. But I'm proud of it as a indication that we can take these kind of holistic systems level views of things like education. But that's just happened. It's just happening. So, I may not think the same thing in 2 or 3 years' time. I don't know. I suppose in some ways, and I hope this doesn't sound arrogant, but I'm pretty proud of IDEO. I'm pretty proud of not so much the organization itself, the company, although I love what we've done with the company. It's been a great place to spend the last 25 years of my career. But I'm quite proud of creating an organization that's able to create the level of enthusiasm and interest in the world that we've been part of. We haven't been solely responsible for, absolutely, but we've been part of generating that at a time when I think we need optimism and creativity. And so I guess if I was to say what I'm most proud of, it's probably that. And some of the decisions we made really early on about how we weren't going to be protective of what we thought and what we knew how to do, that we were going to be very open about it. We were going to do our best to share. We were going to do a lot of teaching. Because I think it was those fundamental decisions. And the very first decision we ever made as a company, which was, and I didn't make it because I didn't found IDEO, but David, who did found IDEO, wrote a letter to the 5 guys that he wanted to found the company, who said, and he'd been working in big corporations for a while, he said, I just want to make a company where I can work with my friends. And IDEO is not a place where 600 friends work together anymore, because you can't have 600 friends, even despite what Facebook might try to tell us. But we've built on that. We've built on this idea that a place you work can be a place where you want to have your life, not just be the place you work. And friends are the people you want to have your life with, right? You want to spend your life with. So, I guess, long-winded answer, but that's what I'm proud of.
Well, I'd like to close off by, of course, thanking all of you. It's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Often I try to think through what my takeaways are, and I've already mentioned some, but you actually captured in your last answer one of the takeaways for me, which was the sense of optimism and the idea of your work and the company, to me, does embody a sense of optimism about problems. But of course, there's a discipline to it as well, and there's a connection to real problems that, to me, is extraordinarily exciting, and I think that's why everyone here is excited by your visit. With that, I'd like to thank Tim Brown for being here, and we look forward to continued conversation organized by the Design and Innovation Club. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks.